Hi everyone, my name is Claudia Steer. I am the founder and principal designer of NW10 Interiors, and this is my background into how I became an interior designer. I've come to learn is that there's a lot of ambiguity around interior design, like lots of questions like, how do you become an interior designer? Do you have to go to school for it? Is a designer the same thing as a decorator? Do you have to be a creative person in order to learn how to be a designer? Lots of looming questions. I will say everyone's journey is different, and in this video you're going to learn a bit more about my journey into the world of interior design. As a child, I had absolutely no idea that I was going to end up being an interior designer, although I did want to be an architect very early on. So I don't even know if I knew what interior design was growing up. I grew up in what people understand as projects in the US, but housing estates back home. And I did grow up with my grandmother and quite a few other family members, and never really had a place to call my own. And so I ultimately found that there were certain places I felt more at peace and more safe than others. And for me, those environments were school, I know, corny, and the library. Those are my two safe spaces where I felt like I could be myself, I could express my creativity, I could create my own different worlds in my mind, in my imagination, without fear of judgment or kind of repercussion. That was probably the very first time I connected the idea of a space being able to create a sort of emotion in someone, and understanding the impact of space in that way. So that's kind of the first germination of my interest in creating environments. And what ended up happening is when I would have friends over, people would comment on how things, how the colors looked, how the place felt. And shortly after that, people would ask my opinion on design choices and selects. And yeah, that carried on for a really long time. And then I was like, oh, maybe this is a thing. I don't think I remember the very first time someone asked my reco, but I do remember an impactful occasion where I was able to support someone. One of my sorority sisters had actually miscarried, and she was, not in the best space, and she had recently bought a home, and I had offered to help her redesign the dining room, just to keep her mind off things, just to bring an element of joy into her life at the time. And it was like a DIY project. We were actually doing some wood paneling on the walls, and we really had a good time. And I think that space ultimately ended up bringing a lot of joy into her life, even if it was just for a moment, at a really challenging time. So it wasn't the very first time, but it definitely was a moment for me where it was like, this skill can actually bring joy into people's lives in a very unexpected way. And that kind of stuck with me. My very first DIY thing was a built-in shelving system to surround the fireplace and the TV. But it was unique because there was like a trap door for like access to like plumbing, and it was off-centered. So the bookshelf actually had to be all on one particular side. And it was a masterpiece and a disaster at the same time because it was so not structurally sound at all. But I was very proud of it. It kind of like had a minimal kind of aesthetic to it. And again, it was the first time I think I had thought of a unique idea in my head and then saw it brought to life in real life. So yeah, I do remember that one. I've moved a lot, people. I had moved to Miami. This was my first like good paying job. I don't like living in like cookie cutter places. So I was looking for a home that felt unique. And I ended up having one of those like carriage houses behind someone else's house as my first apartment. and it was almost like a blank slate. It wasn't super premium or anything, but I do remember going in there and like, yeah, I'm gonna go ham. And I did ask the landlord if I could paint the cabinets for the kitchen and what parameters there were, and she said knock yourself out. So I think the very first thing I did was paint the kitchen cabinets. If anyone's ever done that knows that it's not the easiest undertaking, but for a very sort of basic cabinet, like it really gave a lot of punch of color in that space. I think I painted them like a sage green or something. I remember building my own sofa, building the base and getting pillows made. Like I was trying to go for a very minimal aesthetic, if I remember correctly. Looking back at it, probably looked a hot mess, but I was very, very proud of it because a lot of it was due to my own sort of sweat equity. So yeah, that was the very, very first time, I think. And she kept a lot of it even after I left. So, and that was a sort of ongoing trend with my rentals where I didn't have to change things back. Somewhere along the way, I learned that like there is actual value to interior design. Several times as I've prepared to move to the next place, the incoming tenant or the landlord would actually suggest that I don't change things. So I have like painted walls and ceilings certain colors, and when people come in, it leaves such an impact that they're like, oh, you can leave that, you don't have to revert it back. And so that's when I started to pick up there is really like an intrinsic value to like customizing a space. Another hint that I got over the years that I was destined for interior design was actually when I was in advertising. So I worked for some major brands. McDonald's and Sprint were two of the bigger brands that I worked at. And I got an opportunity to work on the retail side of those businesses. And it was during those seasons where I started to understand that, oh, there is actual science to some of the decisions that are being made in these environments. So certain colors are chosen to elicit certain emotions and reactions from people, that the layouts are intentional to encourage shopping, to drive appetite. And it was like super, super intriguing to me. It really started to like open my eyes, like, oh, it's not just thinking about the human experience, which is what I was obviously focused on in advertising, but also how we want people to feel and how we're actually designing it to make them feel that way. So once I was able to connect these two dots, I was like, ooh, I think this is where I'm supposed to be. So I don't know if you've ever felt this way, where it's like someone keeps asking you, or your community keeps asking you for your opinions and thoughts on things. But that was the case for me. Like people were constantly asking for my opinion. I constantly found a lot of joy and peace when I was designing. And I thought, yeah, this thing's not going away. And so maybe there's something to it. And so around about when I was 30, I decided I think I'm going to go back to school. So I joined a master's program in the evenings in Chicago and went to school while I worked full time. And it was like a light bulb went off. I was just enamored. I was like a kid in a candy store. I just felt like I had found my thing and had so much joy in school. I mean, I'm a nerd anyway, but I really did geek out in school because I finally found what I thought was my creative expression. I always felt creative, but I didn't quite know what my thing was. And then design school kind of just made it super, super clear where I was supposed to be. I don't think I ever knew I wanted to have my own business. I don't think that was ever the intention. I just knew I wanted to be an interior designer. But in school, I started to feel that the intention of the program was essentially to funnel you into firm life. And once I learned exactly how much junior designers make, as a grown woman at 30 something, I knew that ship had sailed. So I said, yeah, I cannot make $30,000 a year anymore. So it looks like I'm going to have to start my own thing. So NW10 was actually bred out of necessity. I just felt like I had to do my own thing I was grateful for what school taught me, but being broke at 30 was not what I was trying to do. So, to be completely honest, I cannot remember exactly who was my very, very first client. But I do remember I treated myself as my first client. There was one particular apartment I got that I was very intentional about the design for the very first time. So it went from treating my own spaces like a testing ground of what's possible to actually trying to design a space that I wanted to live in. So I do remember me being my very first client for real. But what does stick in my mind was my very first epic fail as an interior designer. Um, I was referred by a friend to his boss who had a condo in New York, and I had created a design that she and her husband had absolutely loved, but I was woefully unaware and under experienced when it came to the process of actually making it come to life. So, one thing school teaches you is how to imagine things, they don't actually teach you about the practicality of getting it done. Right, so the fact that you actually have to get permits for things, and that you actually have to submit applications for things, and that you actually have to connect with an architect to get stamps for approvals. And my imposter syndrome was on 100 trillion with that particular client, and I do remember ghosting her for a really long time because I just was embarrassed, I was ashamed, and I just didn't think I had the chops. And I do remember actually running into her in New York City, because New York is small like that in a weird way, years later, and apologizing profusely. I was mortified, but I'll never forget that experience, to be honest, as you can see. I think sometimes it's necessary to I was like, oh, okay, there's still more for me to learn. I was out of school, but clearly there was so much more to the business that I had to learn. So I was grateful for that experience. So I hope you guys enjoyed learning a little bit more about my background and my journey into interior design. On this channel, I will be talking more about that, in addition to just my perspective and lens on the industry, as well as how the intersection of branding and interior design actually come together, and how you can then translate that into your business spaces or your residential spaces. So tune in, and look forward to seeing you soon.